Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today's story takes us to 1859, to the life of Thomas Wiggins, a black boy forced to live under exploitation, who could sit at a piano and play with the brilliance of Mozart, yet never spoke a single word. People called it a miracle. But behind the applause, there was a darker truth no one wanted to face. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. In the summer of 1858, inside a packed concert hall in Columbus, Georgia, something happened that no one in attendance could explain. Over 800 people had gathered that night. Wealthy plantation owners sat in the front rows with their wives, dressed in silk and satin. Local politicians whispered among themselves. Newspaper reporters clutched their notebooks, waiting for something worth writing about. They had all paid good money to see what the advertisements called the greatest musical curiosity in the American South. But none of them were prepared for what they were about to witness. The stage was simple. Just a grand piano, polished to a mirror shine, sitting alone under the gaslight. The audience grew quiet when a white man in a tailored suit walked out and raised his hand. His name was James Neal Bethune, a lawyer and former newspaper editor who had made his fortune in land and slaves. He smiled at the crowd like a circus ringmaster about to reveal the main attraction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you are about to see will challenge everything you believe about the Negro race. What you are about to hear will make you question the very nature of God's creation. I present to you a boy who cannot read a single word, a boy who cannot write his own name, a boy who doctors have declared mentally deficient, barely capable of feeding himself or dressing without assistance. And yet this same boy will sit at this piano and perform feats of musical genius that the greatest composers in Europe could not match." The audience murmured. Some laughed nervously. Others leaned forward in their seats. Bethune paused for effect, then gestured toward the side of the stage. "I give you Blind Tom." A small figure emerged from the shadows. He was 8 years old, though he looked younger. His skin was dark, almost blue-black in the gaslight. His eyes were closed, covered by thick, milky cataracts that had made him blind since birth. He walked with an odd, shuffling gait, his head bobbing slightly, his hands flapping at his sides in a strange, rhythmic pattern. The audience gasped. Some women covered their mouths. A few men shook their heads in pity or disgust. This was not what they expected. This was not a performer. This was a broken child, clearly damaged, obviously simple-minded. Several people began to stand, ready to demand their money back. But then the boy reached the piano. He did not need anyone to guide him to the bench. He found it himself, his small fingers brushing against the wood until he located the keys. He sat down, adjusted his position, and placed his hands on the keyboard. The room fell silent. And then Thomas Wiggins began to play. The music that poured from that piano was unlike anything those 800 people had ever heard. It was Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique, one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, a composition that professional musicians spent years trying to master. The blind child played it flawlessly. His fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was exactly as Beethoven had intended. The dynamics rose and fell like ocean waves, soft as a whisper in one moment, thunderous as a storm the next. When he finished, there was no applause. The audience sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Bethune smiled. He had seen this reaction before. "If any gentleman or lady in the audience would like to test young Tom's abilities," he announced, "please come forward. Play any piece of music you wish, no matter how complex, no matter how obscure. Tom will listen once and reproduce it exactly." A man in the third row stood up. He was a music teacher from Macon, a classically trained pianist who had studied in Philadelphia. He walked to the stage with a skeptical expression, sat at a second piano that had been placed nearby, and began to play a complicated etude by Chopin, a piece filled with rapid scales and intricate fingerwork. Tom sat motionless, his blind eyes staring at nothing, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something far away. The music teacher finished. He turned to Tom with a smirk, confident that this trick would end here. Tom placed his hands on his piano and played the etude back. In the 17th measure. The audience erupted. Over the next hour, person after person came to the stage to test the boy. A church organist played a hymn he had composed himself, a piece no one else in the world had ever heard. Tom reproduced it perfectly. A woman played a simple melody with her right hand while playing a completely different melody with her left. Tom played both simultaneously, then added a third melody of his own invention with his feet on the piano pedals. A German immigrant played a folk song from his homeland, singing the lyrics in German as he accompanied himself. Tom played the song back and hummed the melody in perfect pitch, even mimicking the man's German accent. By the end of the night, grown men were weeping, women had fainted. The music teacher from Macon sat in his chair with his head in his hands, muttering that he had wasted his entire life. And James Bethune stood at the side of the stage, counting the money in his head. That night in Columbus was not the first time Tom had performed, and it would not be the last. Over the next 5 decades, the blind boy from Georgia would become the most famous musician in America. He would play for presidents and generals. He would fill concert halls across the country and tour Europe to standing ovations. He would earn the equivalent of over $20 million in today's money. But Thomas Wiggins would never see a cent of it. He would never choose where to live, what to eat, or when to sleep. He would never have a friend, a wife, or a family of his own. He would remain, in every way that mattered, a slave, even after slavery ended. Even after the law said he was free, even until the day he died. This is the true story of Blind Tom, the greatest musical genius America ever produced. And this is the story of how America destroyed him. Thomas Green Wiggins was born on May 25, 1849, on a plantation in Harris County, Georgia, near the small town of Columbus. His mother was a woman named Charity, sometimes recorded as Charity Green, who was owned by a man named Wiley Jones. Charity had already given birth to at least 12 children, all of them scattered across different plantations, sold away from her over the years. Tom was her 13th child, and from the moment he was born, it was clear that something was different about him. The baby emerged from the womb with his eyes covered by thick white cataracts. He was completely blind, unable to see even shadows or light. But that was not the only thing wrong with him. In the days and weeks after his birth, Charity noticed that her son did not behave like her other children. He did not respond when she called his name. He did not look at her face when she held him. He did not cry when he was hungry or uncomfortable. He simply lay there, silent and still, as if he were somewhere else entirely. The other enslaved people on the plantation whispered that the child was cursed. Some said he had no soul. Others said he was punishment from God for some unknown sin. Even Charity, who loved her son despite everything, sometimes wondered if there was anything inside that small, silent body at all. In the fall of 1850, when Tom was about 18 months old, Wiley Jones decided to sell off some of his slaves. He needed money to pay debts, and the slave market in Columbus was active. Jones gathered his healthiest workers and brought them to the auction block, where planters and farmers from across the region came to inspect the merchandise. Among the buyers that day was James Neal Bethune, a 46-year-old lawyer and newspaperman who had recently purchased a large plantation called Solitude in Muscogee County. Bethune had come to the auction looking for field hands, strong men who could clear land and plant cotton. but his attention was drawn to a woman standing at the edge of the group, clutching a small child in her arms. The woman was Charity. The child was Tom. Bethune examined them with the cold, calculating eye of a businessman. Charity was healthy and strong, probably good for another 15 or 20 years of work. But the child was clearly defective. Blind, unresponsive, probably simple-minded. No one would pay good money for a slave who could never work. Wiley Jones knew this. That was why he was selling Charity and Tom together as a package. It was the only way to unload the damaged goods. Jones offered them at a steep discount, just $400 for the pair, a bargain price even by the standards of 1850. Bethune hesitated. He did not want to feed and clothe a useless child who would never contribute anything to the plantation. But Charity was a good worker, and the price was too low to pass up. He made the deal. And so Thomas Wiggins became the property of James Neal Bethune. Neither of them knew it at the time, but this transaction would change both of their lives forever. The first years at Solitude were hard for Charity and Tom. The plantation was new and undeveloped, with thick forests that needed to be cleared and swampy land that needed to be drained. Charity worked long hours in the fields, while Tom stayed in the slave quarters, cared for by older women who were too weak for heavy labor. As he grew, it became clear that Tom was unlike any child anyone had ever seen. He still did not speak. He showed no interest in playing with other children. He spent hours sitting alone, rocking back and forth, humming strange melodies to himself, running his fingers along any surface he could find. He seemed obsessed with sound. He would press his ear against the ground to hear the vibrations of footsteps. He would tap his fingers against walls and floors, listening to the echoes. He would sit outside during thunderstorms, his face turned toward the sky, drinking in the crash and rumble as if it were music. The other enslaved people did not know what to make of him. Some thought he was touched by spirits. Others thought he was simply an idiot, a damaged creature who would never amount to anything. The Bethune family ignored him entirely. He was just another slave child, and a broken one at that. He had no value, no purpose, no future. But everything changed one night in the summer of 1855, when Tom was 6 years old. The Bethune family had gathered in the parlor of the main house for an evening of music. James Bethune's daughters were taking piano lessons, as was expected of proper Southern young ladies, and their teacher had come to hear them practice. One by one, the girls sat at the Steinway grand piano that dominated the room and played their simple exercises, their small fingers stumbling over the keys. No one noticed the small figure crouched outside the window, hidden in the darkness. Tom had followed the sound of the music from the slave quarters. He had never heard a piano before, and the sound fascinated him. He pressed his face against the glass, his blind eyes staring at nothing, his entire body vibrating with the notes that floated through the air. When the lesson ended and the family went to bed, Tom did something that should have been impossible. He found his way to the back door of the house, which had been left unlocked. He navigated through rooms he had never been in before, avoiding furniture and obstacles by listening to the echoes of his own footsteps. He found the parlor. He found the piano. And he began to play. The sound woke the entire household. James Bethune grabbed his pistol, certain that an intruder had broken in. His wife and daughters huddled in terror. The overseer came running with a lantern. When they burst into the parlor, they found little Tom sitting at the piano bench, his blind eyes closed, his small fingers moving across the keys with supernatural grace. He was playing one of the pieces that Bethune's daughter had practiced earlier that evening. He was playing it perfectly. Bethune stood frozen in the doorway, his pistol hanging limp at his side. He watched the blind, mute, supposedly idiotic slave child perform music that his own daughters could barely manage after months of lessons. And in that moment, James Neal Bethune realized that he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Over the following weeks, Bethune conducted what he called experiments on Tom. He brought in local musicians to test the boy's abilities. He had them play increasingly complex pieces, watching in amazement as Tom absorbed each one after a single hearing and reproduced it without error. He discovered that Tom could play with his hands crossed, with his back to the piano, even with a cloth draped over the keyboard so he could not feel which keys he was pressing. The music seemed to flow through him from some unknown source. But there was more. Tom did not just reproduce music. He created it. He would sit at the piano for hours, improvising melodies that no one had ever heard, compositions that ranged from simple and sweet to dark and complex. The music poured out of him like water from a spring, endless and effortless and utterly original. Bethune was not a musical man himself. He could not read sheet music or play any instrument, but he recognized something that mattered far more in the antebellum South. He recognized an opportunity to make money. In 1857, when Tom was 8 years old, Bethune organized the first public exhibition of the boy's talents. He rented a concert hall in Columbus and plastered the town with advertisements. He promoted Tom not as an artist or a musician, but as a curiosity, a freak of nature, a marvel to be witnessed like a two-headed calf or a bearded woman at a circus. The show was a sensation. The concert hall sold out. People came from miles around to see the blind Negro boy who could play piano like a European master. Bethune charged 50 cents admission, a significant sum in 1857, and still turned people away at the door. By the end of the night, he had made more money than his plantation earned in a month. Bethune immediately began planning a tour. He pulled Tom away from his mother and the only home he had ever known. He loaded the boy into a carriage and set off across Georgia, then South Carolina, then the rest of the South, staging exhibition after exhibition in towns and cities large and small. The format was always the same. Bethune would give his speech about the idiot savant, the mental defective who could somehow channel musical genius despite his damaged brain. Then Tom would play. Then the audience challenges would begin. Every night, local musicians would come forward to test the boy, certain they could stump him, certain the whole thing was a trick. Every night, Tom proved them wrong. The money rolled in. Bethune invested it in more advertising, more tours, bigger venues. By 1858, Blind Tom was the most talked about act in the American South. Newspapers ran breathless reviews of his performances. Scientists and doctors published papers trying to explain his abilities. Religious leaders debated whether his talent was a gift from God or a curse from the devil. And through it all, Tom remained a slave. He slept in back rooms and basements. He ate scraps and leftovers. He had no say in where he went, what he played, or how long he performed. Bethune owned him completely, body and soul. The question of how Tom developed his extraordinary abilities has puzzled researchers for over a century and a half. Modern experts now believe that he was almost certainly autistic, exhibiting what would today be classified as savant syndrome, a rare condition in which individuals with developmental disabilities display exceptional abilities in specific areas such as music, mathematics, or memory. Tom showed many of the classic signs of autism throughout his life. He had difficulty with social interaction and communication. He engaged in repetitive behaviors like rocking and hand flapping. He showed intense focus on specific interests, particularly sound and music. He had sensory sensitivities that made certain textures and temperatures unbearable. And he possessed what appeared to be perfect pitch and an eidetic memory for music, able to hear a piece once and store it permanently in his mind. In the 19th century, none of this was understood. The term autism would not even be coined until 1908, the year Tom died. In his own time, he was simply classified as an idiot, a person of such low intelligence that he was considered barely human. This classification was convenient for the white people who profited from him. If Tom was not really a person, not really conscious, not really human, then there was nothing wrong with using him like a trained animal. but the evidence suggests that Tom was far more aware than anyone gave him credit for. He responded to kindness and cruelty, showing visible distress when treated harshly and visible pleasure when treated well. He formed attachments to certain people and avoided others. He had preferences and desires, even if he could not express them in words. And most importantly, he had opinions about his own music. Bethune discovered early on that Tom could not be forced to play. If he was tired, hungry, or upset, he would sit at the piano in silence, no matter how much Bethune threatened or cajoled. If he did not like a particular piece of music, he would refuse to learn it or would play it mockingly, exaggerating its flaws. And if he was in the mood to compose, he would ignore all requests and play only his own creations, sometimes for hours at a time. This was not the behavior of a mindless automaton. This was the behavior of an artist. By 1860, Blind Tom was the most famous musical performer in the American South. He had played for governors and senators. He had performed in the finest concert halls from New Orleans to Richmond. He had been written about in newspapers across the country and in several European publications. He was, by any measure, a star. He was also still a slave. The question of Tom's legal status was complicated even by the standards of the time. James Bethune had purchased him as property, like a horse or a piece of furniture. But Tom was also a human being, at least in the eyes of God, if not the law, and his unprecedented abilities raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of intelligence and the justification for slavery. Southern apologists had long argued that Africans were mentally inferior to Europeans, incapable of higher thought, suited only for manual labor under white supervision. Blind Tom demolished this argument simply by existing. Here was a Negro, a slave, a person classified as property, who could outperform any white musician in the South. Here was proof that black minds were not inferior, that African blood did not preclude genius, that the entire intellectual foundation of slavery was a lie. Bethune was aware of this contradiction, and he worked hard to explain it away. In his advertisements and speeches, he emphasized Tom's supposed mental deficiency, his inability to care for himself, his animal-like nature. Tom was not really intelligent, Bethune insisted. He was merely a vessel, a freak of nature, a biological anomaly. His musical ability was not evidence of a sophisticated mind, but rather a kind of parlor trick, like a dog that could count or a horse that could tap its hoof in response to questions. Tom was remarkable, yes, but he was not human in the way that white people were human. This explanation satisfied most white audiences. It allowed them to enjoy Tom's performances without questioning their own beliefs about race. They could applaud his music while still believing in their own superiority. They could marvel at his abilities while still supporting the system that kept him in chains. But not everyone was convinced. Abolitionists in the North seized on Blind Tom as evidence of slavery's injustice. How could anyone claim that Negroes were mentally inferior when a blind slave child could outperform the best white musicians in the country? How could anyone justify owning a human being who possessed such obvious genius? The debate over Tom intensified as the 1860 presidential election approached and the country lurched towards civil war. For Bethune, the timing was dangerous. If the Union won and slavery ended, he would lose his most valuable asset. Tom was worth more than the entire plantation, more than all of Bethune's other slaves combined. Losing him would be financial ruin, so Bethune took steps to protect his investment. In 1859, he drew up a legal contract with Tom's parents, Charity and her husband Mingo, who was enslaved on a nearby plantation. The contract stated that the Wiggins family agreed to let Bethune keep Tom and manage his career in exchange for a small annual payment and the promise that Tom would be well cared for. The contract was a sham, of course. Charity and Mingo could not legally enter into contracts because they were slaves. They could not negotiate terms because they had no leverage. They could not refuse because refusal meant punishment or sale. The document was designed to give Bethune a paper trail, something he could point to if Tom's ownership was ever challenged in court. And indeed, that challenge was coming sooner than anyone expected. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. The South seceded from the Union. James Bethune, a loyal Confederate, sent his sons to fight for the cause. He donated money and supplies to the Southern Army. And he continued to tour with Blind Tom, staging concerts across the Confederacy to raise funds and boost morale. Tom became, in effect, a propaganda tool for the Southern cause. Bethune presented him as proof of the benevolence of slavery, evidence that enslaved people were well cared for and even allowed to develop their talents under the wise guidance of their masters. Confederate newspapers praised Tom's performances as symbols of Southern culture and refinement. Confederate generals attended his concerts and shook Bethune's hand. What Tom thought about all of this, no one knows. He could not speak, could not write, could not express his opinions in any way that white people would recognize or respect. He simply played the music they asked him to play, performed the tricks they demanded, and kept whatever thoughts he had locked inside his silent mind. But perhaps the music itself was a form of expression. Because during the war years, Tom began composing pieces with titles like The Battle of Manassas and March to the Battlefield, ostensibly celebrations of Confederate military victories. These compositions were hugely popular with Southern audiences who heard in them the glory and triumph of their cause. But musicologists who have studied these pieces in recent decades have found something strange. Hidden within the triumphal melodies are darker elements. Dissonant chords that sound like screams, rhythms that echo the crack of whips, minor key passages that evoke sorrow and mourning rather than victory. Some researchers believe that Tom was encoding his true feelings about the war and about slavery into music that his white audiences could not fully understand. If this is true, then Blind Tom was not just a passive victim of the system that enslaved him. He was a secret rebel, expressing his resistance in the only language available to him, hiding his defiance in plain sight while white Confederates applauded and cheered. The war ended in April 1865 with the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. A month later, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. 4 million enslaved people were suddenly free, including Tom's mother, Charity, his father, Mingo, and every other black person in the South. Tom should have been free too. He was 16 years old now, a young man who had spent his entire life performing for white audiences and earning money for white owners. He had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, more than most free people earned in a lifetime. He deserved his freedom and the chance to control his own life and career. But James Bethune had other plans. Within months of the war's end, Bethune went to court and filed for legal guardianship of Tom. He argued that Tom was mentally incompetent, unable to care for himself, in need of a responsible white person to manage his affairs. He produced doctors who testified that Tom was an idiot, a creature with the mind of a young child, incapable of making decisions or handling money. He pointed to Tom's strange behaviors, his inability to speak, his apparent confusion about the world around him. The court agreed. In 1865, the same year that slavery ended, Thomas Wiggins was declared a legal ward of James Neal Bethune. Tom was free in name only. In practice, nothing had changed. Bethune still controlled where he lived, what he did, and where his money went. The chains had simply been replaced by paperwork. And so Blind Tom's slavery continued, hidden behind the legal fiction of guardianship, invisible to a nation that was trying to convince itself that the sin of slavery had been washed away. This was not unusual. Across the South, white people were finding new ways to control black labor without calling it slavery. Black codes restricted where freed people could live and work. Vagrancy laws allowed police to arrest black people for being unemployed and force them to work without pay. Sharecropping trapped families in cycles of debt that lasted for generations. But Tom's situation was unique. He was not a field hand or a domestic servant. He was the most famous musician in America, a performer who had played for presidents, a genius whose abilities defied explanation. And he was still, in every way that mattered, a slave. The concert tours continued. Bethune took Tom north for the first time, staging shows in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Northern audiences packed the halls, eager to see the famous blind Tom they had read about in newspapers. Abolitionists protested outside some venues, demanding Tom's freedom. But the shows went on, and the money kept flowing into Bethune's pockets. In 1866, Tom performed at the White House for President Andrew Johnson. It was one of the most prestigious engagements of his career, a command performance for the leader of the nation. Johnson was reportedly impressed, though what Tom thought about playing for the man who was actively undermining Reconstruction and betraying the promises made to freed people remains unknown. By the end of the 1860s, Blind Tom had earned the equivalent of several $1 million in today's money. He had performed hundreds of concerts across the United States and begun planning tours of Europe. He was, by any financial measure, one of the most successful entertainers of his era. And he still owned nothing. Not a house, not a dollar, not even the clothes on his back. Everything he had earned belonged to James Bethune. Everything he would ever earn would belong to James Bethune or his heirs. The guardianship arrangement ensured that Tom would remain a source of wealth for white people.